The other day, I was doing a bit of research and trying to come up with a real snazzy title for a video about critical race theory. And I kept seeing this phrase: critical race theory is coming for the dogs. And since this is being suggested to me on YouTube, that means people are actually looking this up. And I had no idea what it meant. You probably don't either. So I did a quick Google search, and that takes me to this article, which is actually a book review of this book entitled The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals. And if you thought that this was just going to be a book talking about dogs and animal shelters, you are wrong. Because it explains that the dogs who are sent to shelters and put to sleep in shelters and all of those inequalities are powerfully linked to human ideas about race, class, gender, ability, and species. So what we'll see as we're going throughout this video today is that critical race theory is essentially the idea that everything must be viewed through the prism of race. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear Robin DiAngelo.
You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue.
And so this is why this book is actually a perfect example of critical race theory, because it's so absolutely ridiculous, it makes no sense, but at the same time, maybe it kind of does. Not really, but that's what they think anyway. So let's look at some of the excerpts, because this book is too good to pass up. The book starts in chapter 1 by talking about Monster, who was a dog who was sent to an animal shelter and eventually put to sleep. And the author argues that Monster died because he lived in a community of lower income people of color where they already have a lot of challenges that threaten their ability to keep dogs and keep relationships in general. But also that breed discrimination is itself grounded in racism and classism. Now, I don't know a ton about dogs, but there is this notion that I believe isn't really based in facts, that pit bulls are more dangerous or more violent. So that is certainly breed discrimination. But to say it's based in racism and classism, it's kind of stretching it. The next sentence here is my favorite. So make sure you count all of the trigger words that you're going to hear. So we're going to look at that. But before we do, if you like this video so far, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And you'll get more videos just like this, as well as my video explaining more in depth what critical race theory is and why it's racist. So stay tuned for that one. So she says that what happens when they get to the shelter, if they live or die, is the outcome of everyday and sustained collusions of capitalism, anthroparchy, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And which animals we think deserve saving come from ideas about race, class, gender, and ability, and all of this shifts the responsibility for the death of the animals off of the shelters and onto low-income minority communities. So effectively, if you have a dog that you can't take care of or you abuse it or anything like that, it's not really your fault if it goes to a shelter, it's the fault of the shelter. They should have the blame because of racism and classism and white supremacy and patriarchy and everything you could think of. But if you thought that was bad, apparently the entire point of the shelter and the volunteers is to try and get companion animals into homes that they consider suitably reinforces capitalistic logics of companion animals as commodities, white supremacist beliefs in the inferiority of racial ethnic minorities as animal guardians, and in the animality of black bodies, patriarchal ideas that caring for companion animals is women's labor, and anthroparchal commitments to maintaining human dominion over animals. That was a mouthful. That was a lot of stuff. So essentially, people in the shelter, according to her view, they decide who gets to take an animal home and adopt it based on their own white supremacist, capitalistic, patriarchal, misogynistic views. Which is nonsense. That's not how it works at all. This is completely insane. But this wasn't enough. I wanted to learn a little bit more about this book. I didn't want to buy it because that's a waste of money. So I went back to this article we saw at the beginning, and they give a little book review with some more excerpts from this ridiculous book. Apparently, this book also says that allowing dogs to sleep inside is a privilege reserved for the white and the wealthy, and that you can't have policies against keeping dogs chained up in backyards because they're just intended to oppress people of color by imposing middle-class norms of animal keeping. So if you want to chain your dog up in the backyard, and there was a policy against that because in many instances it could be considered inhumane, well, that's just you being racist. You're not looking out for the dog at all, you're just hating on people of color. Furthermore, as we talked about earlier, if someone can't really take care of their dog, that's not their fault at all, that's society's fault at large. For example, people of color who abandon their dogs in empty apartments are simply victims. and they are under the duress of sudden eviction or deportation or arrest. And so they just can't take care of their dogs. And in many instances, apparently they think this is for the best because, quote, the constraints of their knowledge and resources, both of which are limited by the nexus of their class, status as immigrants, and ethnicity. So let me unpack that just a little bit. The author is claiming right here that people of color don't really know how to treat their dogs or their animals because they're too stupid, apparently. And so they think that just leaving them in apartment buildings or tying them up outside or abandoning their dogs, that's the best thing they can do for them because they're just so unintelligent and uninformed. This is horrifically racist. She is saying that people of color are limited by the constraints of their knowledge and resources because of their ethnicity and their immigration status and all of that stuff. That is 100% racist. That is the bigotry of literally no expectations. But she's not done yet, because apparently, if, for example, a black woman leaves her dog to die at a pound after using her for years as a breeder and selling her puppies to buy drugs, the only reason she did that is because of her, quote, status as a poorly educated queer woman of color. So she's not only a woman of color and poorly educated, but she is queer as well. And that must mean that it's fine to treat a dog extraordinarily inhumanely because you just don't know any better. And this article kind of summarizes what I think is a really good point about critical race theory, and that is right here, where she says that white people act, they're the ones who do things, but people of color are acted upon. And this is a very common thread that you see when you're talking about critical race theory or anti-racism or anything like that. It's the idea that people of color or minorities, they just don't have any real sort of power, and so they don't have actions that they can choose from. They don't really do anything. Things are done to them. They are the victims of everything. Even if they leave their dogs in an apartment building and abandon them, they are victims because of society at large. So I recognize in the grand scheme of things, this is just one stupid book talking about it, but it does show the mentality behind anti-racism. And not pushing back on crap like this is how we get White Fragility as a bestseller, which obviously it shouldn't be. So if you're interested in more ideas about critical race theory, where it comes from, why it's so inherently racist and wrong, like I said, make sure to subscribe. Because in the next little while, I'll have a video coming out about the history of critical race theory, where it comes from, but more importantly, real tangible examples from people who are well known in society today. Not some random author talking about dogs in shelters and how sad it is and how racist it is, but actual, real, renowned people. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, make sure you comment down below what you think about this book. And hey, if you want to waste money, go ahead and buy it. Maybe you'll have a good laugh or two. I wouldn't suggest it because I don't want to support someone like this, but go ahead. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.